Now we commence the first panel discussion of the day, the domestic landscape making India secure. I would like to invite Mr. Vineet Kumar Goel, Mr. Rakesh Agarwal and Mr. Nandakumar Sarvade. So Mr. Nandakumar Sarvade would be moderating the session.
So I would like to start this particular session, and we'll have a tea break after this, I promise. So we have a panel of this particular panel, as I mentioned earlier, is to deal with the domestic issues in cybercrime, and we have two very distinguished panelists with us. Mr. Rakesh Agarwal, who is an IPS officer of 1994 batch, served with National Police Academy, the Central Bureau of Investigation, and has been one of the leading authorities in the Indian police on cybercrime. He has in-depth knowledge of not only the investigative side, but also on the international cooperation side. Today I have requested him to speak on the domestic side issues, what kind of trends are there. So we'll start with his presentation, and then we'll take some question and answer because he has to leave early, and then we'll go to Mr. Vineet Goel, who is our next panelist. I'll introduce to him later.
A very good morning to all of you. During the course of this next 10 minutes, on this presentation, I've flagged certain issues which I just wanted to throw open to the House, and also present my views, whatever I've gathered in this field in last about 10 to 15 years. Now, I've classified these issues into these four broad categories. And coming straight to the point, when I look at the law enforcement agencies and look at the state of capacity for dealing with cyber crimes, I find that there's a problem of prioritization. That means, are we according in the correct priority to the area of cyber crimes? If you look at the Director General of Police, or from the government's perspective, you look at this figure, that as per the Crime in India 2014, 7,201 cases of cyber crime were registered in India. As compared to that, there were 3,37,922 cases registered under the category of crime against women. Now, when it comes to resource allocation of the by the Director Generals of Police or the police leaders, how much of priority they should give to the cyber crimes vis-a-vis, let us say, the crime against women. Now, is there a problem of nomenclature? Because are we construing cyber crimes too narrowly? Because is this figure of 7,201 cases under the IT Act, and the crime in India also talks of the cyber crimes under the Indian Penal Code. If we include them also, then the figure comes to 9,622, which is still less than 0.3% of the other category. So, by the problem of nomenclature, I mean that what Mr. Alexander Seeger pointed out, that the electronic evidence somewhere in the cloud or somewhere on the computer, not necessarily a cyber crime. He gave an example of, I think, that the Mumbai murder case, which is nowadays in the newspapers, the locational data being somewhere. The other day there was this Arushi murder case where they were talking about some modem logs, and there are a number of other cases. Even in the Indrani Mukherjee case also, they're talking about, the other day in the newspaper they're talking about some Skype logs or the Skype conversations. So I think if we expand the definition not the definition, but our conceptualization of the cyber crimes to include electronic evidence or the digital evidence lying somewhere, then perhaps it will get the right priority, because in due course, the electronic evidence is likely to become part and parcel of all kinds of crimes, including the crime against women or the homicide or any kind of crime. The second issue that I wanted to flag was, how do we respond to cyber crimes? Should we follow a generalist approach? That means, do we rely upon the general cop to deal with the cyber crimes? Or do we have specialists to deal with the cyber crimes? That means recruit people who have certain skill set to deal with the cyber crimes. That means they have that kind of educational background. That means the sourcing, do we turn cops to the techies? That means the cybercrime specialists, or do we hire the techies and then make them cops? That's the paradox. I find that the first approach is a difficult approach. That means having a conventional policeman with perhaps little or no background in the technology, even if you make him a cybercrime specialist, because of his lack of educational background, I think he'll find it difficult to continuously upgrade himself to this fast nature of changing nature of technology. And I don't find much of a problem in hiring a specialist from the education, from that field, and making him an investigator, because investigation skills are something which can always be imparted. And so I think that is something, it's a debatable issue, but the third thing is, of course, once you hire the specialist, there are some management issues. That means, what kind of service conditions do you provide to them? There will be market pressures. There will be alternate jobs available to them. So how to retain them by giving them enough, these service conditions, because otherwise industry will poach them from the law enforcement agencies, as Krishna Shastri has been poached by the industry from the law enforcement. Another issue I wanted to flag was that I often find that there is a lack of role differentiation when it comes to dealing with cyber crimes. And by role differentiation, I mean that we have been mixing up the role of first responders or investigators with that of forensic scientists in our training curricula that we follow for the policemen. As a result, we try to teach them lots of forensic skills which they will never use as policemen while investigating a case. At the same time, we make the courses much more complex. We end up making the job of a cybercrime investigator seemingly very, very complex, because we are trying to teach him a very, very fine, complex skills of, where the data would reside, etc. It's something like, trying to teach a policeman as to how the DNA analysis and how the DNA technology works, rather than taking it for granted that it works and let the experts deal with that. Then there are, on the management side, the issues of finances, and that doesn't need too much of explaining. That's an issue which is also connected with the priority. And there are some procurement issues, and the procurement issues connected with, the technology obsolescence. You spend some huge amount of money in procuring something, then after 2 years you find that the technology has leapfrogged to another generation, and your equipment is no more good enough. You have to invest more to buy equipment. And it's a very, very vendor-driven market. So every vendor would try to show that your product, what you have, is not good enough. And because of lack of understanding in the police, we would perhaps be nose-driven by the vendor sometime. So this is another problem, which is a management issue at the police level. So how to zero on the right product, and how to keep pace with the technology, so that our capabilities are good enough to deal with the crime. So the idea I have, I just want to throw it before the House is there a case for having a specialist body like what they have is Dixie, I don't know the full form, it's a subsidiary body of the NIC, the National Informatics Center, which standardizes, which sells products off the shelf after evaluating them. So could we have a specialist body? CDAC does some kind of a job, but it does more on developing its own tools. But could it take up the role of technology vetting and then the price vetting, et cetera, so that all police forces, all law enforcement agencies could source their product through CDAC? Coming to the next issue, the jurisdiction, the legal issues. There is a problem of international cooperation, so Mr. Alexander Seeger is an authority on the subject. He's already discussed, and there is a need for multilateral framework like COE Convention. I asked him the question, what are the concerns of the various countries? I, as a law enforcement agent, I was not able to relate to most of those concerns, because to me, you know, the politics of it and etc. is not important. So the bottom line is that there is a lack of international cooperation, so the countries need to find a way to move forward to get that international cooperation. Then there are certain issues which are specific to India, and I've tried to flag this issue by just highlighting one section. Let us take the example of Section 65B of the Indian Evidence Act, which was a specially enacted provision for dealing with the secondary evidence. There was a landmark case, the Parliament attack case, and Mr. Shastri has deposed in that case, in which there was a judgment, the Navjot Sandhu case, the government of NCT of Delhi versus Navjot Sandhu. In that judgment, the Supreme Court reached the conclusion that a secondary evidence, that is the data, the CDR, the call data records, etc., could be adduced in evidence even without the certificate from the owner, if that CDR could be proved by any other means. That means by getting the person in the witness box to say that, okay, this is what I gave, etc., etc. Now, recently, in the Supreme Court has overturned this judgment, and they say now that we have reverted back to the situation that any secondary evidence, that means a printout of a log, etc., can be adduced in evidence only if it is accompanied by a mandatory certificate under Section 65B. Now, this creates a lot of problem for the law enforcement agent, because as technology is getting more and more into our daily lives, how do you adduce a plethora of evidence into in court? Let's take the example of an overspeeding vehicle. Now, you flash a radar, the speed radar at it, and there is a printout which says that this is the speed of the vehicle. Now, for a motor vehicle challan to be supported by this overspeeding ticket, you need a Section 65B certificate before this challan becomes valid, because this is a computer printout. So in another seminar, I was sharing a dais with a Canadian gentleman, where he gave an interesting idea that in some of the countries, very routinely used things like this overspeeding tickets, etc. In the law, there is a presumption attached to these kind of secondary evidences, where they say that it is presumed to be true, and there is no further mandatory requirements to lead that in evidence in certain category of the computer printouts, and that is, I think, the right way to move about it. Legality of covert surveillance. We talk about the cyber surveillance. There are laws in which there are provisions for controlled delivery, like the NDPS Act, etc. We do not have any such provision under the IT Act, where you could, like, for example, for catching pedophiles, you could be running undercover operations, etc. So our law does not support it. So perhaps there is there's a case for that. Then we have a critical dependence on service providers, and that is going to become more and more. The service providers means the network service providers, etc., the all kinds of. So what are their obligations to retain data, and how much data is to be retained by them? I think that's a hazy line, And it's, of course, the law enforcement agencies want the data to be preserved forever. And I know that's not feasible. But then what is that optimum, given the speed of the courts, given the speed of the reporting of cyber crimes, etc. So I think that optimum, that bar has to be raised. Presently it is, I think, 6 months in certain cases, 1 year for call data records, etc., etc. So that's one of the issues. Then there are issues of legal comprehension and need for special courts or expert bodies to advise courts. By legal comprehension, let me put it in a layman's language. What I mean by legal comprehension, somebody gave me a very good thumb rule, and when I was involved in investigating some complex cases, and I would explain my case to the prosecutor, and one of the prosecutors told me that if you cannot explain to me your case in 10 minutes, then it is bound to fail in the court of law. He says that in 10 minutes you have to explain it to me, what happened, who did it, and what is the evidence against that person. Now, I just cannot comprehend a scenario where I can explain to a layman, now layman is the critical word, as to how a malware attack took place and who did that attack in 10 minutes time. So it's too complex. So I think the problem is that we have to have specialists who would either help the courts or the courts would themselves be specialists. So either of the two strategies can work. But then to hope that it's not the fault of the judge or the prosecutor because he's not being trained for, he's not trained in that, he is not being paid for that. But we have to find a solution because this way it cannot work. Next is coming to technology, and remote storage and cloud computing, etc. have been dealt. Security, privacy versus social networking. I think this is, everybody would agree with these issues. But what I really want to highlight was the default settings, which I'm very particular about, and this is one area where the law enforcement agencies should really be interested. And see, the problem is that we as users are too eager to utilize something which we think is good, and that is with the Facebook and WhatsApp and all kinds of social media. The problem is that hardly any one of us are masters at technology, and so we would not take enough pains to dig deeper into it to find out what is happening behind the scenes, etc., etc. But could there be a case where the product in its default settings is secure, or is it oriented towards the privacy rather than it is oriented towards everything open, and if you don't want to be open, then you go dig deep into it and put all the controls that set the privacy settings. So I think that as law enforcement agencies, we should be striving for, or we should be having a partnership with the industry to insist for products of social networking which are the default setting is in the protected mode, the privacy mode. If somebody wants to become, throw open his life to public, that's his wish, and it's a conscious choice rather than a conscious choice being, unconscious choice being that everything is open to the public. I think that would have a significant. There is Mr. Alexander also in the challenge part. He said the anonymity is an issue, and content hosting and subscriber verification. So, is there a case for a better subscriber verification or a mandatory subscriber verification for content hosting, if not for anything else? That means for website hosting, and if I'm hosting some content on somewhere for the hate crimes, etc., then could there be technology also deals with volume of data, and in the question that the learned judge asked, and the poor rate of prosecution, the conviction, the sheer volume of data is so much that we've already reached a stage where nothing comes back from the forensic lab before 12 months' time, or before, or more than that, because they are flooded with hard disks, they are flooded with mobile phones, and the tools can do only that much in a limited amount of time. And of course, there are issues of the inherent insolvability of cyber crimes, the peer-to-peer networking, encryption, the anonymity in the cyberspace, etc. And the last slide is the policy or the societal issues. Since we are running short of time, I'll just use of cybersecurity awareness. Is it time to go to include some of it in the school curriculum? I think there is a good case for including it in the school curriculum. Even in the top schools in Delhi, I don't think there is any such, at a formal level, any such inclusion of this subject. Usable security is an issue. It's a technology issue as well as a policy issue. Two-factor security is a good example. Now, I think RBI has made it mandatory, the two-factor security in most of the transactions. But that is the way forward to make the products or the services more and more hardened, so that it is subjected less to the abuse. And another idea that I would like to flag is, it was highlighted by Mr. Shastri that the banks and the institutions dealing with finances, etc., or the corporate world has some reservations in reporting cyber crimes. As law enforcement agents, can we do something about it? One could be to make it mandatory for at least the public institutions or the corporate world to report the cybercrime as and when it happens, because they are dealing with public money. Should there be a choice with the Punjab National Bank not to report a cybercrime if a crime has happened or data has been stolen? This is one way to look at it. Second is, can law enforcement agencies facilitate reporting of cybercrime by changing their practices? That means, could we introduce some data protection measures, or could we enter into non-disclosure or confidentiality, or could we maintain more confidentiality of the data to encourage such kind of crime reporting? And law enforcement agencies and industry partnership, one example I gave you was of security settings in the default mode. Now I'll end this this brief interaction with the coming back to this issue of how much are we investing in cyber crimes. And I often wonder that were our predecessors smarter than us? Because years back, when they saw the utility of fingerprints in something, I think we had fingerprint specialists in police force. They exist today, even today. And years back, when our predecessors saw the utility of a tracker dog in solving petty crimes, all police forces have a huge number of tracker dogs and the dog handlers. I don't know how much they are doing. I have not seen them doing much. But we, even in the last 10 years, have not been able to create something akin to fingerprint experts or to the tracker dogs or to the dog handlers. So are we investing enough in this important area of our business? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rakesh. That was a very comprehensive flagging of various issues which are very interesting, and I'm sure some of you will take some of these thoughts back and work on those. I would like to now introduce our second panelist, Mr. Vinith Kumar Goyal. He is an IPS officer of 94 batch, currently working as IG Crime in West Bengal, and he has also the distinction of being the Chief Information Security Officer of the West Bengal government. And he has been dealing with cybercrime in his current capacity as well as earlier roles. And so I would like to request him to share his thoughts around what current trends does he see in his day-to-day work, and what kind of capacity issues which are occurring, in addition to, of course, the coordination issues which are across different boundaries. Go ahead.
From here itself. Uh, Good morning to all of you. Thank you, Rakesh, for a very comprehensive overview of the entire topic. Coming to the present landscape of internet, talk about mobile phone telephone connections today. We have about 1 billion telephone connections today, about 300 million internet users. Government has come up with this BharatNet, NOFN, and it's fast expanding. More and more internet users are being added. And who are these internet users who are being added? The other people who are coming from because the urban population is more or less covered, they have access to, the networks are there. But the rural population, semi-literate and illiterate people, because a lot more services are coming online, and it is so much more easy to access these services online. People are wanting to have access to this. Government is wanting to provide access to these services. Think about land records, which were so difficult to come earlier. Now they are digitally available, but for a common man living in a village, obviously he would like to have an access to this. Right now connectivity is an issue, literacy is an issue. But slowly, I think in about 2-3 years' time, we would be more or less covered for the entire country. Now, as Rakesh and other speakers have already pointed out, the state of cybercrime in India. Of course, large part of these cybercrimes are social engineering crimes. Whether it's a lottery fraud, we all keep receiving emails or SMSs of having been received a lottery of a huge sum of money. Employment, people are generally very keen to go abroad for employment because it brings in a lot more money, and they are willing to pay anything for this, and that's where you come across large number of such cases where they part with large sums of money. Identity thefts, like as has been said earlier, on social networks. People befriend strangers and they become victims of identity thefts, blackmails. We often come across cases where the women become victims of these threats, these kind of offenses, where the morphed images are being sort of put on the net and they are being blackmailed. Or maybe just a small, I have a rift or something like this, and this I put it on the Facebook, that XYZ available as escort, call this number. So you just see the amount of trauma the people go through. And there's so much more anonymity on the internet today. You can come up with a Facebook profile with whether you are a male or a female, with whatever gender you wish to, whatever name you might give. You might have a very different profile picture, and the entire profile will be very different as compared to what you are. And then anonymizing services like onion routing, etc., they make it all the more difficult for smart people. And so easy for smart people to learn about how to anonymize yourself or how to sort of commit cyber crimes, because all this information is available online, whether it's YouTube or any other many other services which you can easily learn without having a real IT background to this. And how are we facing it as a law enforcement agency? My experience of working in West Bengal, as the law provides, the inspector is the person there cannot be a person below the rank of inspector as the investigating officer of this case. But majority of the officer in charge of the police stations where the case is being recorded, they are all sub-inspectors. So the SHO of a police station actually doesn't have the power to record that case. Coming to the his understanding about the cyber crime is also very poor. A duty officer who would be maybe an ASI or a sub-inspector, when he has an interface with this person who has come to report about the crime, what does he see? he talks about that this is how I have been defrauded. He looks up his FIR register and says, what is the place of occurrence? Or what is the time of occurrence? Or who is the accused? Now, if the guy is not able to answer these questions, he also is perplexed. Not that he is not willing to sort of record this crime, but he is slightly perplexed. So our capacity to handle these kind of crime, especially in the rural areas, maybe at the district headquarters we have a cyber cell. There are urban areas where we have cyber police stations which have little better capacity in terms of dealing with these kind of offenses and better understanding of these offenses. But at a rural level, where we are planning to expand our services and where the people are likely to be the bigger targets in future, I think our services are very, very limited in this sense, and we need to expand this. As Rakesh had very clearly pointed out, that we have fingerprint experts. We have question document examination bureaus where we have experts. But we have we have not been able to start recruiting experts who have a very good technical background. It's people like us who basically do a bit of research on internet and try to learn about this, undergo some training programs here and there, and with this limited knowledge we try and investigate the offenses which are so complex in nature. Coming to a small example, like how the cybercrime cases are investigated and what kind of problems we face. Trying to give you a real-life example where, like, some businessmen in Calcutta were getting some threatening calls for extortion of money. And of course, they were coming from VoIP service, so the number was not being picked up. But fortunately, the guy gave them a number which happened to have a code of European country. Now, to find a subscriber from that European country was a Herculean task, because they would just not. And as has been pointed out, we are not a signatory to Budapest Convention, but then even in Budapest Convention, I was reading an assessment report where they say it takes about 6 to 20 months to get a MLA request honored. So there are 24/7 desk helplines and things like this, but I think in many places they are not working very well. That's the report which I had gone through. But where India is not a signatory, that's a big issue, how exactly we deal with this. Fortunately, going through the sort of diplomatic channels, we could get illicit response. And then we found it was a VoIP service from a different country in Europe, which was providing this particular service. Now, when you talk to that VoIP service, again you go to a different country, diplomatic channels, again issues. But fortunately for us, they were quite understanding, and they did help us out in reaching out to this VoIP service, who started giving us some kind of a data. Now, when you go to this VoIP service, then you find who is the subscriber. Then it gives you some mail ID, some IP addresses, which belong to a different country. The mail service provider is very different, and you ask for further. So there are no easy answers to investigation of these cases, because it's a chain. And if AMLAT request, the other day I was talking about, I was reading an article where CBI officer has confessed that it takes about 40 months for a AMLAT request to be honored. Now, investigation is not just about being honored one AMLAT request, but there will be multiple such scenarios which we will have to sort of deal with to reach out to the final culprit, collect evidences, produce that particular evidence in the court of law. So, I guess what could help, of course, the conventions and treaties are there, but I think a better solution could be to LEA to LEA agency contact. I think they work much better, faster, but how exactly this can be brought about in a more formal way. I think informally we always try and deal with it in this particular way, but I think we still don't have the formal channels of communication with the corresponding LEAs of different countries. And even in our own country, what we face today is for routing the entire request, it is a Herculean task, because preparing a AMLAT request, there are a lot more issues. It has to route it through RMHA, MEA, Ministry of Home Affairs, then they pass an order, then it comes to, we get a court order, then it goes to the CBI, then to the corresponding agency. Of course, these are some of the issues which are very challenging and create hurdles in investigation of crime, which have become day-to-day part of our life. Coming to other issues, I think we're talking about crimes, but the social networks, which are very close networks. For example, WhatsApp. There was a huge debate after the Paris attack that should these kind of services have backdoors, or how the law enforcement agency is going to deal with these kind of services. This is about a terror incident, but you talk about rumors. The impact of social media on politics, governance. We all heard of Arab Spring example, where how the Facebook was used, which finally resulted in overthrowing of governments in Tunisia, the government in Libya. I think Syria had a tough time, Iran had a tough time, and of course in our own country, like Nirbhaya Kand, how people have been able to organize themselves. Of course, there are positive manifestations of this, but there are a lot of negative manifestations of this as well, where the people coming together on social media, spreading rumors, it has resulted in some kind of communal incidents and things like this. Similarly, I think the social media plays a very negative role in sort of instigating communal riots, which we have seen in last few incidents. We got to deal with all these kind of issues of social media, how best to deal with it, how to get information from the social media in the earliest possible way, and how to communicate with the people. Maybe using the social media services, using the existing media like TV, newspaper, etc., to communicate with the people and sort of calm these kind of law and order problems. So we have the impact of the cyber space on both crime, law and order, our intelligence, national security, etc. We have our critical infrastructure, which is all networked, whether it's power lines or our data centers, etc. And of course, these network infrastructure can be targeted. How best to sort of deal with these kind of offenses, where maybe the enemy countries are involved while targeting these kind of, the way it happened in Georgia or in 2008. So I guess these are certainly challenges which we as law enforcement agencies do face, and we need to work in partnership with the private sector to deal with these issues, which we are trying to do. Hope we'll have a better cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinith, for that grounds-up look and very useful to know. We are running severely behind schedule, so I will not exercise my prerogative of having expert comment on everything, and we'll just have a few questions from the audience. So if there are any questions, can you please raise your hand and the mic will reach you? Yes, please.
Yeah, one question is, I'm Smita. One question is that this two-factor authentication that you have introduced, how much has it statistically helped us to...
I think this is more a security question, but...
because it is not there in other countries. I mean, it's not in... it's like, we have a few of the unique places where it has been introduced.
I think multi-factor authentication, it is helping. For example, what is happening? I have a username and password, and that's the password is the only security with which I am doing a transaction. Now, somehow somebody hacks into my system and steals my password. I have no way or no control over my transactions. Somebody else is going to be transacting on my behalf. Now, if I have a two-factor authentication, if it is in the form of a SMS to my OTP or in some kind of a biometric authentication, obviously it is an additional check where there is some kind of a guarantee that XYZ is doing this particular transaction. And I think it has prevented to a very large extent. But there are certain crimes, that is again social engineering crimes, where when you trick people into even getting the OTP. So that is also happening, but that's actually reduced the number of incidents in a very, very large. I won't have the figures, but I think it has helped a lot. Thank you.
Yes, please. Can a mic come here?
Yeah, I just wanted to have one question that whether our...
Can you introduce yourself, please? Can you introduce yourself first?
Myself Deepak Ghai, I'm from ESRM team from TCS side. So the question is that whether our IT Act is capable enough and demarcation is there with respect to what our evidences are admissible there. Because there may be special courts there, they would be collecting some evidences there, but whether it is clear demarcation in IT Act and it is strengthened enough that it would admit these evidences for execution.
If I understood your question, what you're saying is the evidence collected by us under the...
Does our IT Act is strengthened enough to have a demarcation that these are the evidences which are admissible and can be executed for trial?
Yeah, of course. See, I think it's a slightly technical question in the sense there's the Indian Evidence Act which defines what is the primary evidence and what is the secondary evidence. And if the courts would generally means as a rule they would insist for primary evidence. So that means they will insist for, if there is a primary evidence in the form of a hard disk, then the hard disk itself has to be sent to the forensic lab. However, in case of the Information Technology, when the Information Technology Act was passed, it was realized that it is not possible in all the cases to have primary evidence in the IT environment. So they introduced a special legislation a special section under the Indian Evidence Act, which is Section 65B, which says that where the primary evidence is not available, how the secondary evidence is to be, and there are a number of conditions under which that secondary evidence can be adduced. Those conditions take care that it is pure and it could not have been tampered. So there is absolutely no doubt that there is a demarcation that what can be led as evidence in the court as far as the electronic evidence is concerned, what cannot be.
So one last question there.
Hi, this is Shipra from Accenture Services. And my question is, like, India is a major service provider, not a product provider. It is considered to be in IT as a major service provider. And the most of the data, the organizations, the Indian service provider organizations are handling are the customer data that are originating from other regions of the world. And does the IT Act regulate the use of the data that is originating from other world and that is incoming to India? I mean, we are having contracts with customers or the originating parties how to secure their data. Like if the data is being originating from European Unions, we have DPP there. So does IT Act regulate on use of the data from the other world that is being used at India?
So I will answer this question. Having worked with the Indian IT industry. So jurisdiction in cyberspace is a very interesting idea, and sometimes it is beneficial to look at cyberspace as a continuum where the series of actions which result in crime are happening in different locations. However, for the purpose of invoking jurisdiction, the place which is most convenient from the victim point of view, from the investigation capability point of view, that is the facility which is available in cyber crimes. Coming to the specific point of outsourced data being given protection of IT Act, it definitely is there, and all offences which are defined, and Budapest Convention actually offers a very good categorization of these. are included in the IT Act. In various sections, these are covered. And if there were to be any malicious incident involving that data, the Information Technology Act definitely will cover those instances. And an investigation can be initiated in India because the data, it resides in India, it is getting processed in India, and some of the malicious actor may be present in India. So to that extent, the law is adequate to cover those kind of scenarios. So I think with this, we have completely run out of time. We will have just a quick 10-minute tea break. Before we reassemble, there is a very bigger panel awaiting us at the other end of the tea break. I just wanted to thank both of my panelists. They are not only batchmates from the 94 batch, but Rakesh is a Chevening scholar in cybersecurity who did a program in UK, and Vineet will shortly be joining that program soon. So my thanks to both of them, and a round of applause for both of our panelists. Thank you. We meet in exactly 10 minutes here.